I was watching a creative team review project the other day, and the room was thick with that typical mid-afternoon fatigue. But the lead designer, he was leaning back, looking pretty satisfied as he finished his presentation. Then someone in the back asked the simple 5-word question, "What are you trying to say?" And immediately, the energy in the room just shifted. You could actually see the designer's pupils dilate. He didn't just give a quick answer, he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing in focus. It was like a searchlight had suddenly switched on inside his head, scanning for a deeper meaning he hadn't even considered 5 minutes ago. He looked like someone who'd been humming a song and was abruptly stopped right before the chorus. He was physically, almost neurologically compelled to finish the loop. He was in this state of productive tension. His brain's reward system was just lighting up because he was hunting for an answer. But then the atmosphere took a sharp, really uncomfortable turn. Another executive in the corner chimed in, but his tone was different. He asked, "Why did you mess up the original timeline on this?" The transformation was jarring. I mean, truly. The designer who had been glowing with this almost giddy problem-solving energy just moments before, he suddenly went rigid. His shoulders pulled up toward his ears, his face flushed, and that searchlight focus just vanished instantly. He didn't look like a creator anymore. He looked like someone cornered in an alley. The curiosity was gone, replaced by this visible defensive wall. He wasn't thinking about the project's goals anymore. His brain had handed the keys over to his amygdala, shifting into pure survival mode. It was a fascinating and, frankly, a slightly unsettling contradiction to witness. That instantaneous shift from a brain rewiring dopamine rush to a complete neurological shutdown was triggered by nothing more than a string of words ending in a question mark. It really made me realize that a question isn't just a request for information. It's a biological trigger that can either act as a fuel for your mind's highest potential or a kill switch that shuts it down entirely. It leaves you wondering, what exactly is happening under the hood when we ask or are asked a question.
What you saw was the human brain toggling, instantaneously, between its highest potential operating system and its emergency shutdown sequence. And it was all because of two different ways of framing an inquiry. This deep dive is really about recognizing that difference. We're going beneath the surface of conversation to explore the specific neurobiological systems, the ones governing curiosity, focused thinking, social threat detection, and survival prioritization. For you, the listener, this is kind of a shortcut to understanding why certain conversations drain you and others energize you. And maybe more importantly, how to craft communication that consistently unlocks the best thinking in yourself and in others.
Okay, so let's unpack that productive state first. The designer was focused, leaning in, physically compelled to clarify his message after that first question. What are you trying to say? That feeling, that need to finish the loop, it feels like a psychological force, but you're suggesting it's deeply biological.
It is. It's rooted in what we call the fundamental goals-first architecture of motivation. The mind operates not by reacting purely to external stimuli, but by creating and pursuing these internal representations of desired future states. We call them goals.
Right.
And these goals are the primary drivers of all cognitive action. They're orchestrated in the prefrontal cortex, specifically in regions that act as our future state planners and utility calculators.
So if the mind starts with a goal, then that first question essentially supplied a new, slightly more abstract one, like define the core message more clearly. And once that new goal was selected, everything changed.
Exactly. The shift from, an initial maybe vague goal to a refined, challenging one, like a clarifying abstract concept, it moves the brain from a state of goal selection to a state of goal engaged.
And those are two very different things.
Oh, qualitatively different forms of mental life. When you're in the selection phase, the brain is careful. It's weighing costs and benefits rationally. But once a goal is selected and the system is engaged, the pursuit of progress toward that goal comes to completely dominate the brain's effective value function. The whole system biases everything toward perseverance. The difficulty of the question actually fueled his focus.
I always hear about dopamine and rewards, but is this just about eventually getting praise, or is something deeper happening inside the brain that makes the search itself the struggle to clarify rewarding?
Something much, much deeper. That drive is fueled by what we call phasic dopamine bursts. These aren't the broad, baseline levels of dopamine we'll talk about later. These are rapid momentary surges. And they're triggered not just by receiving a primary reward, but crucially by the learned value system, or LV system.
Okay, learned value system.
Yeah, think of the LV system as a sophisticated internal bookkeeper that monitors progress toward an expected outcome.
A bookkeeper that gives you a little hit of satisfaction every time you tick a box.
Precisely. A phasic dopamine burst signals a positive change in the current best estimate of the probability of goal achievement. So when the designer started refining his message, every clarifying thought, every successful connection he made generated a mini reward. It reinforces the actions that led to that tiny increment in progress. This mechanism is incredibly powerful.
And that explains why we feel compelled to finish things.
It's an evolutionary mechanism, absolutely. This ties into the concept of the Zeigarnik effect, where incomplete tasks hold greater cognitive priority. Think about it from an ancestral context. If you started building a shelter or locating a critical resource,
You can't just wander off.
right, your brain needed a mechanism to prevent you from being easily distracted by lesser tasks. That compulsion to finish the loop or close the information gap is the LV system doing its job. It's prioritizing unfinished, survival-critical information processing.
That perfectly explains the searchlight focus. The work itself became the reward. So what's the role of conscious thought here? Is the designer consciously mapping out all his next moves?
Well, conscious thinking about the future, what's known as prospection, is fundamentally for guiding action. It's not just about passively predicting what might happen. It's an active process. Very active. It's about creating and navigating the future. When we look ahead, the future exists as a matrix of maybe.
A matrix of maybe. I like that.
It's not a single fixed path, right? It's a branching set of alternative possibilities and outcomes. When the designer was planning how to clarify his presentation, his brain wasn't dwelling on past mistakes. It was activating agentic concerns.
Agentic concerns. So what he could actually control.
Exactly. It focused on aspects under his direct control, better strategy, stronger visual aids, clearer language. That active focus on what you can influence is what keeps the approach system engaged and that dopamine flowing.
Okay, so that drive to achieve the goal means the designer needs to execute his plan, but he also has to be open to finding a slightly better, more accurate explanation in the process. When we're searching, how does the brain know if it should stick to the current known plan or, venture out for a radically better but unknown idea?
That is the exploration-exploitation trade-off, and it is a continuous neurobiological dilemma that all living things face.
Right.
Should I exploit the known resource, the established route to a known goal, or explore a new resource, a potentially better unknown path? And this isn't a philosophical choice. It's regulated by a dial deep in the brain.
So where is that dial located?
The neural circuit responsible for choosing action and thus modulating this fundamental trade-off is centered in the basal ganglia. Specifically, the input nucleus called the striatum.
The striatum.
Yeah, think of the basal ganglia as the brain's main action selection switchboard. Computational models show that the output of the basal ganglia creates a probability distribution function for action selection. It basically determines which actions are most likely to be chosen.
And what sets the parameters for that probability distribution? I mean, what's controlling the switchboard?
The baseline level of tonic dopamine in the striatum. Now, tonic dopamine is distinct from the quick phasic bursts we just discussed. Tonic dopamine is the steady, ambient concentration that acts as a thermostat or a regulator for that exploration-exploitation balance.
So let's say the designer is intensely focused deep in that productive tension. What happens if his tonic dopamine level is high?
When tonic striatal dopamine is increased, it robustly decreases the entropy or the uncertainty of that action selection probability distribution.
Entropy. Okay, so it reduces the randomness of his choices.
Exactly. Entropy, in this context, measures how spread out your choices are. Decreasing entropy is the neurobiological equivalent of giving the designer tunnel vision, but in a good way. It concentrates the likelihood of selection around known, high-value actions. This significantly enhances the exploitation of existing, known knowledge and strategies.
Which is what you want when you're executing a plan.
It's optimal when you're executing a plan in a stable environment, yes.
Okay, wait, let me try to translate that. So, high tonic dopamine narrows the focus. It makes the brain less likely to be distracted by radical new ideas and more likely to execute the known best path efficiently. Is that an accurate way to explain D1 receptor activity?
That's a perfect functional explanation.
Okay.
Studies show that this control is primarily dominated by the activation of the D1 receptor in the striatum. Increased D1 activation consistently decreases that entropy, promoting exploitation.
And why is that a fitness maximizing strategy?
Because often maximizing gains means efficiently utilizing the resources you already know about, rather than wasting energy searching for something that's only marginally better.
So, the designer in my story, being pushed to clarify his existing data, was in a totally optimized state. High exploitation to finish the presentation goal, but the question was just open enough that the brain still needed to explore the structure of the message itself. It was a finely tuned balance that promoted high efficiency and deep focus. That is a phenomenal way to frame productive tension. It's the dopamine system, literally optimizing performance by balancing leveraging past knowledge with actively searching for the next best step forward.
It's neurobiological efficiency. The brain was rewarding him for defining the goal and then regulating the focus needed to achieve it. But as we know, that state of focus is fragile.
And now we flip the switch. The second question, why did you mess up the original timeline on this? Resulted in that immediate physical defensive posture, rigidity, flushing, the focus just vanishing. It was a complete neurological shutdown. I really want to spend some time on this. Why does social criticism activate the same circuitry as running from a lion?
Because the brain prioritizes survival above everything else. And for hierarchical social creatures like us, social survival is physical survival. At the end of the day, that's what it is. Social neuroscience has proven that the brain uses similar and often identical circuitry for processing social threats like loss of standing or criticism as it does for processing primary survival needs like physical safety. The overarching organizing principle is simply minimizing danger.
And this response is instantaneous. How fast are we talking here?
The amygdala, the brain's central alarm system and its associated threat networks, process these cues non-consciously, automatically, and quickly. We're talking under 200 milliseconds or a fifth of a second.
Wow.
So the executive's tone and the words mess up tag that stimulus as dangerous before the designer's conscious mind even had time to construct a rebuttal. And the avoid response is typically faster, stronger, and more long-lasting than the approach response we were just discussing.
Okay, so let's categorize these threats. You mentioned a framework for this.
We can. A helpful framework is known as the SCAR-ARF model. It's an acronym that summarizes 5 domains that, when threatened, activate that primary avoidance circuitry: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And that single aggressive question, why did you mess up the original timeline on this, was a masterclass in triggering the threat response. It hit at least 3 of these domains simultaneously.
Let's start with the one that feels the most visceral, the status threat. That was direct attack on his professional competence.
Absolutely. Status is all about relative importance. When the executive framed the issue as an error or a failure, it was a direct assault on the designer's perceived status and competence within the group hierarchy. And you might think status loss is just, an abstract feeling, but the neurological data says otherwise.
It's physical.
It is. Studies using fMRI have shown that a drop in perceived status activates the very same brain regions associated with experiencing physical pain. The designer's rigidity and flush were literal biological responses to pain avoidance.
So he wasn't just defending his work or his reputation. His brain was engaged in a deep-seated defensive maneuver against, neurological pain.
Precisely. If we look at the adaptive functions of the threat response, especially in hierarchical group dynamics, avoiding status loss is paramount. In ancestral environments, loss of status could mean loss of resources, loss of mating opportunities, or even social exclusion.
Which was basically a death sentence.
Effectively, yes. So the brain is hardwired to defend its current social standing with fierce, reflexive intensity. Even if that means defending an irrational position simply to avoid the pain of the perceived emotion.
Okay, that covers the pain element. What about the uncertainty that question introduced?
That's the profound certainty threat. The brain is built to predict. It craves certainty because prediction saves cognitive resources. The moment the executive criticized the timeline without specifying the full scope of the error or the consequence or the path to correction, the designer was thrown into massive ambiguity. He didn't know what was messed up, how bad the executive thought it was, or what the expected timeline should have been.
It's the difference between being told, you have a flat tire and you have a tire problem. One is actionable, the other is just a massive, stressful unknown.
Exactly. Even a small amount of uncertainty generates an error response in the orbital frontal cortex. Imagine a flashing red icon on your computer. It distracts your attention away from whatever you were doing until it's resolved. The designer's internal focus instantly pulled from what is the meaning of my design to the high priority alert. Assess the full severity of this unexpected threat.
And finally, autonomy.
Autonomy threat. This refers to the perception of control. The executive's question, why did you mess up, focuses entirely on past uncontrollable actions. Being directly criticized for something already done or, implicitly questioned about one's ability to influence future outcomes generates a massive lack of control. Research shows that the ability to exert control over a stressor determines whether that stressor is mildly annoying or highly destructive. When autonomy is threatened, agency vanishes, and the default response is defensiveness and retreat, which perfectly matches the designer's posture.
So we've established that the designer couldn't access his searchlight focus anymore. The entire creative engine stalled. Why does engaging survival mode make us demonstrably worse at complex creative thinking?
It's a literal resource allocation problem in the prefrontal cortex, the PFC. That's the central hub for executive functions like planning, working memory, inhibition, all that good stuff. When the amygdala lights up and the threat circuitry engages, resources, and I mean actual glucose and oxygen, are immediately diverted away from the PFC.
So there's a direct trade-off.
A strong negative correlation. The more threat activation, the fewer cognitive resources are available for that linear conscious processing.
So he was physically, biologically less equipped to produce a creative solution?
Absolutely. Insight, creativity, finding subtle connections. All of that is impaired because the cognitive resources required for complex pattern matching have been hijacked. When the brain is under threat, it prefers fast, simple, and often generalized responses. Fight, flight, or freeze.
And the designer entered a freeze state.
He did. Unable to access the nuanced thinking that the first question had so successfully stimulated.
This sounds like a system-wide crash. You said the most critical component is something called the central bottleneck, which explains the instantaneous nature of the shutdown.
This is the crucial mechanism. Complex thought, the kind required to integrate a goal, select an action, and execute a plan, is an effortful process. It requires the brain's limited capacity central cognitive resources. It's not like breathing. It requires focused attention.
Right.
The central bottleneck theory, which is often demonstrated using what's called the psychological refractory period, or PRP logic, it posits that while the brain can handle basic sensory input and motor output in parallel, there is only one central cognitive stage, one narrow processing channel that can handle effortful, conscious processing at any given moment.
It's like a single critical printer in an office. Only one print job can run at a time.
That is a perfect analogy. And the most important job gets priority. When the social threat hit, it instantly triggered the resource-intensive social survival process. Let's call that task 1. Assessing the threat level, determining a defense strategy. This high-priority task immediately occupied the central bottleneck.
So task 2 gets pushed out.
The logic of effect propagation shows that when task 1 takes over that central stage, task 2, which was clarifying the creative design and requires rich, effortful encoding, is forcibly postponed.
So the creative goal didn't just fade away, it was dissolved because the essential cognitive machinery was completely occupied by the assessment of the status, certainty, and autonomy threats.
Yes. The energy and focus generated by the dopamine-fueled progress were instantly wiped out. The designer was biologically forced into a state where survival assessment trumped all other cognitive goals, making that immediate shutdown unavoidable.
Okay, so we've built this model showing two competing neural states, the maximizing goal-driven approach state and the minimizing threat-driven avoidance state. If they're so different, how does the brain decide which system is in charge at any given moment?
Well, they exist within a hierarchical goal processing architecture, which is primarily orchestrated by the frontal lobes. At the very top, you have the centers that calculate net utility, how much reward you get versus how much effort or pain it costs.
Okay.
This is largely handled by the orbital frontal cortex, the OFC, and the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC. The OFC is tracking progress and value, essentially monitoring the school of the goal pursuit. And the ACC is the brain's utility calculator, constantly assessing the costs and benefits of any action. Positive learned value minus negative learned value.
So in part 1, the designer's OFC and ACC were calculating a high utility for the goal. Something like, it's hard, but refining this message will increase my standing and feel good.
Precisely. They were maximizing utility and goal progress. But when the second question hit, the system had to switch instantly to minimizing immediate cost and pain. And this is where the amygdala and its robust threat networks come in.
The override.
It's a total override. Because the avoidance signal is so potent and rapid, it's designed to save your life, it immediately overrides the more nuanced, strategic, and frankly slower dopamine-driven goal system of the frontal cortex.
So the ACC is calculating refining the design is worth 100 points and the effort costs 20 points for a net gain of 80, but the amygdala just cuts in and screams, status loss equals 500 points of pain. Abandon mission now.
That's a good analogy for it, yes. The amygdala signal, which is focused through specific areas of the ACC, like the subgenual ACC or Area 25, is designed to initiate immediate active avoidance and defensive behaviors. The system is neurologically prioritized because, well, if you're physically or socially dead, no amount of strategic planning matters.
Right.
It is an adaptive priority switch.
That rapid switching is certainly adaptive for survival, but what allows us to make truly wise long-term decisions that balance these two drives, rather than just reacting impulsively all the time.
The key is conscious foresight and simulation. The capacity to choose among that matrix of maybe relies on the ability of the conscious mind to mentally simulate the emotional outcomes of our potential choices. This is known as anticipated emotion. We don't just act based on what we feel right now, we act based on what we predict we will feel later.
So if I simulate what I'll feel, say, intense regret, if I don't start a difficult project now, that anticipated regret provides the necessary push to overcome the inertia.
That's exactly right. Anticipated emotion is a crucial feedback loop that guides wise behavior. It ensures we avoid decisions that lead to extended regret or guilt down the line. You're basically forecasting the emotional consequence from your future self's perspective. It provides a strategic advantage over simply reacting based on immediate, current feelings.
That sounds like incredibly intensive mental work, though. It must require enormous cognitive capacity.
It is, which is why the brain is constantly preparing for it, even when you think you're resting. When we're not actively engaged in a specific external task, the default mode network often becomes active.
Mind wandering.
It's traditionally associated with mind wandering, yeah, but research shows this is actually productive. This downtime is frequently used for spontaneous planning, for future goals, and generating contingency matrices. Your unconscious mind is auto-generating that matrix of maybe, preparing the brain for later choices and effective performance.
Huh. So it's not wasting time.
Not at all. This constant low-level preparation ensures that when a new goal is suddenly engaged, the cognitive system isn't starting from scratch. It's already built the scaffolding for future success.
So we have the framework. The high potential state is goal-engaged, it's dopamine-fueled, and it's prone to maximizing progress while underestimating cost. The kill switch state is threat-driven, resource-depleting, and focused only on minimizing pain. So the ultimate application for you listening is designing interactions, whether they are team meetings, one-on-ones, or even your own self-talk, to keep the system in that desirable goal-engaged state.
That is the crucial takeaway. The goals-first framework provides a warning. Once a goal is engaged, costs are underestimated. Hello, confirmation bias. We want that perseverance, but we have to protect it by minimizing threat activation. And the SARF model is your practical cheat sheet for doing this.
Okay, let's start with the most destructive trigger from the story. Status threat. How do we reduce the pain of criticism or error correction?
We have to decouple feedbacks from hierarchy. When status is threatened, the designer felt pain because the executive was comparing his current performance to an external standard. To reverse this, you allow people to compare their current performance to their past performance. So instead of saying, your work is below standard, you structure the interaction so the individual is prompted to review their output against their own previous best efforts or their own stated objectives.
So a manager might say something like, look at this section against the clarity standards you set for yourself last month. What do you think needs adjusting?
Precisely. That activates the reward circuitry by making them feel better than their past self. They're achieving self-mastery, which is a powerful intrinsic reward. And it avoids the painful status comparison with an external authority. You've replaced external critique with internal objective setting, keeping that dopamine approach system running.
That's a really powerful reframing. Next, let's tackle the certainty threat, which paralyzes the mind with those flashing red error messages.
Certainty is all about clear expectations. The moment ambiguity is introduced, cognitive resources are drained. In a meeting context, this means eliminating the "I don't know what you expect" problem. For you, the listener, if you're leading a meeting, start by providing clear boundaries. This meeting is 30 minutes long, we will cover points A and B, and the goal is to leave with a decision on X.
No ambiguity.
None. If you're delegating, don't just state the task. Provide the criteria for success and failure and a specific check-in date.
So instead of saying, fix this timeline problem, you frame it as, the problem is deviation X. The expectation is to be back on track by Friday, using method Y. How will you approach that?
That structured clarity immediately reduces the error response in the frontal cortex. It allows the person's attention to remain goal-focused. You're not just managing the project, you're managing their neurological resources by keeping the environment predictable and safe.
And finally, autonomy threat. That feeling of micromanagement and lack of control. How do we inject control back into the system?
By offering choices, even small ones. Autonomy is highly rewarded because it fuels the perception that we can successfully influence our environment. If you present a task as, here is what you must do, you trigger avoidance. But if you frame it as, here is the objective, you can achieve it using method A or method B. Which path allows you to leverage your expertise best?
You give them back a sense of control.
You provide an autonomy reward. It's hugely powerful.
That is useful even in high-pressure scenarios. Even if the ultimate outcome is non-negotiable, giving control over the process, the sequence, the tools, the location, that keeps the brain goal-engaged.
Think about it. When people feel respected, safe, and in control, the cognitive system opens up. They start seeking information they would completely miss in an avoid state. This is how SCARF translates from a social model to a neurobiological imperative. Minimizing these social threats is the act of protecting the dopamine approach system and ensuring the PFC has the necessary resources to engage that exploration-exploitation dynamic at its peak. What this deep dive ultimately reveals is that a question is not just a query, it's a profound neurological test. It instantly signals to the brain whether it should dedicate its highly limited central processing power to the difficult work of creative construction and strategic goal pursuit, or whether it must immediately divert all those resources to the faster, more reflexive process of social and physical survival. The choice of language determines resource allocation. It's that simple.
And the key takeaway here lies in recognizing the profound biological power of the language we use. We are constantly designing the neurological environment of our conversations. Communication isn't just about sharing information, it is about regulating neurochemistry. Designing communication that intentionally minimizes social threat, leveraging frameworks like SCARF, is truly the neurological prerequisite for unlocking peak cognitive performance. The difference between a designer hitting their stride and a designer hitting a defensive wall is not a matter of willpower. It's a matter of chemistry and architecture. Next time you draft an email or phrase a critical question, remember that you are not just asking for a response, you are delivering a biological instruction set for either maximal creativity or complete shutdown.